The autumn evening draped itself over Princeton like a worn velvet curtain, heavy with the promise of intellectual collision. Inside Murphy's Tavern, a narrow establishment squeezed between a used bookstore and a philosophy department coffee shop, the amber glow of vintage bulbs cast long shadows across weathered wooden tables. The air hung thick with the scent of aged whiskey and the lingering aroma of pipe tobacco, creating an atmosphere where great minds had wrestled with eternal questions for decades. Thomas Murphy, the tavern's elderly proprietor, moved with practiced efficiency behind the polished mahogany bar, his weathered hands polishing glasses with the rhythm of a man who had witnessed countless debates unfold within these walls. Tonight felt different, charged with an electricity that made even the most seasoned regulars pause their conversations and glance toward the corner booth where two extraordinary figures sat across from each other. Augustine of Hippo sat with the bearing of a man who had stared into the abyss of human nature and emerged with unshakable faith. His dark eyes, intense and penetrating, reflected the weight of 13 centuries of Christian thought. Despite his ancient origins, he appeared as a man in his prime, his presence commanding respect through quiet dignity rather than boisterous proclamation. His hands, long and expressive, rested calmly on the table beside a leather-bound journal filled with marginalia in Latin and Greek. Across from him, Bertrand Russell adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles with the precise movement of a mathematician solving an equation. His sharp features and penetrating gaze spoke of a mind that had dismantled empires of illogical thought with surgical precision. The Nobel laureate's reputation for intellectual fearlessness preceded him into every room he entered, and tonight was no exception. His tweed jacket, worn but impeccably maintained, bore the invisible armor of a man who had challenged kings, philosophers, and gods with equal vigor. The debate had been arranged through the peculiar machinations of academic providence, a symposium on consciousness and mortality that had brought together scholars from across time and space, metaphorically speaking, to grapple with humanity's most persistent questions. The evening's formal presentations had concluded hours earlier, but the real conversation was just beginning. Murphy approached their table, carrying a tray with 2 glasses, aged whiskey for Augustine, gin for Russell, and set them down with the reverence of a priest placing offerings on an altar. He had learned over the years that certain conversations required liquid courage, not for cowardice, but for the vulnerability that comes with examining one's deepest beliefs. "Gentlemen," Murphy said with his gentle Irish brogue, "the evening is yours. May your words find their mark and your minds find their peace." Augustine lifted his glass slightly, acknowledging the blessing, while Russell nodded with the courtesy of a man who respected ritual even when he doubted its efficacy. As Murphy retreated to give them privacy, the weight of their impending conversation settled over the corner booth like morning fog over a battlefield. The tavern's other patrons seemed to sense the gravity of what was about to unfold. Conversations dimmed to whispers, and even the most animated graduate students found themselves unconsciously leaning forward, straining to catch fragments of what promised to be more than mere academic discourse. Russell broke the silence first, his voice carrying the crisp precision of Cambridge halls. "Augustine, my friend, we find ourselves in a curious position tonight. 2 men separated by more than a millennium, united by our shared fascination with questions that have tormented humanity since consciousness first turned inward upon itself." Augustine smiled, an expression that carried both warmth and the accumulated weight of human suffering he had witnessed. "Indeed, Bertrand, though I suspect we approach these eternal questions from rather different vantage points. You see the universe as a vast machine operating according to discoverable laws, while I see the fingerprints of the divine in every sunrise and every human heart." The Englishman took a measured sip of his gin, his eyes never leaving Augustine's face. But that's precisely what makes our conversation so necessary. Tonight, we're not here as representatives of our respective centuries, but as human beings grappling with perhaps the most fundamental question our species has ever posed. When our bodies fail and our brains cease their electrical dance, does something essential about us persist? Augustine leaned forward slightly, his intensity evident but controlled. "You frame it as though we're debating the existence of unicorns or the possibility of perpetual motion machines. But the soul, dear Russell, is not a hypothesis to be tested in your laboratories. It is the very foundation upon which human dignity, morality, and meaning itself rests." "And there," Russell replied with a slight smile that revealed both admiration and disagreement, "we arrive at the heart of our philosophical divide. You begin with the assumption that human dignity requires immortality, while I contend that dignity emerges from our capacity to create meaning in the face of mortality. The evening air outside began to carry the first hints of winter's approach, and inside the tavern, the temperature seemed to rise with the intensity of their exchange. Other patrons found themselves drawn into the orbit of the conversation, their own debates falling silent as they recognized the rare privilege of witnessing two titanic minds engage in intellectual combat. Augustine's hands moved as he spoke, sculpting his thoughts in the air between them. But consider this, my friend. If consciousness is merely the byproduct of neural activity, if our deepest loves and highest aspirations are nothing more than electrochemical reactions destined for extinction, then what prevents us from concluding that life itself is nothing more than an elaborate joke played by an indifferent universe? Russell's response came with the measured cadence of a man who had faced this question countless times and emerged unbroken. Perhaps because the joke, if it is one, is our joke to tell. The universe may be indifferent, Augustine, but we are not. We create meaning through our relationships, our art, our science, our compassion for one another. The fact that these achievements are temporary makes them more precious, not less. The debate was truly beginning, and both men could feel the familiar thrill of intellectual combat coursing through their veins. Around them, the tavern had transformed into a gladiatorial arena where ideas would clash with the force of centuries, and truth, elusive and magnificent, would dance just beyond their grasp, challenging them to reach higher, think deeper, and risk everything in pursuit of understanding. The whiskey in Augustine's glass caught the lamplight as he raised it thoughtfully, the amber liquid reflecting the complexity of emotions playing across his weathered features. Outside, the Princeton evening had deepened into full darkness, and the tavern's windows had become mirrors reflecting the intimate theater of their philosophical duel. "Bertrand," Augustine began, his voice carrying the resonance of a man who had preached to emperors and comforted the dying, "your words paint a picture of humanity as cosmic orphans, creating meaning in a universe that neither knows nor cares about our existence. But tell me honestly, when you held your newborn children for the first time, did you truly believe you were gazing into the eyes of a sophisticated biological machine destined for oblivion?" Russell's composure flickered almost imperceptibly, the question striking closer to home than abstract philosophical arguments ever could. He set down his gin with deliberate care, buying himself a moment to navigate between intellectual honesty and personal vulnerability. "You fight dirty, old friend," Russell said with a rueful chuckle that held genuine affection. "But I'll answer you honestly. When I held my children, I felt an overwhelming sense of connection that transcended any rational explanation I could offer. The love I felt was real, immediate, and more powerful than any philosophical argument I've ever constructed." Augustine leaned back slightly, recognizing both the courage and the evasion in Russell's response. "And yet you still maintain that this love, this connection that moved you beyond words, is ultimately nothing more than evolutionary programming designed to ensure the survival of your genetic material." The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implications that extended far beyond academic debate. Murphy, who had been wiping the same glass for several minutes while eavesdropping shamelessly, set it down and pretended to busy himself with inventory, unwilling to miss a single word. Russell's fingers drummed against the table in a pattern that suggested internal calculation. "The power of an experience doesn't validate our interpretations of it, Augustine. A sunset is no less beautiful because we understand the physics of light refraction through atmospheric particles. Love is no less meaningful because we can map its neurochemical pathways." "But can you?" Augustine challenged, his eyes beginning to burn with the intensity that had once converted entire populations to Christianity. "Can your beloved science truly explain why one arrangement of carbon and nitrogen and trace elements looks into the eyes of another and declares, 'I would sacrifice everything for you'? Can it explain why humans create art that serves no survival function? Why we weep at injustices committed against strangers? Why we lie awake at night haunted by moral choices made decades ago?" Russell felt the familiar sensation of being intellectually cornered by a master dialectician. Augustine had spent his youth as one of the Roman Empire's most gifted rhetoricians before his conversion, and that training showed in his ability to find the hairline cracks in seemingly solid arguments. "You're asking me to explain consciousness itself," Russell replied, his voice steady but tinged with the frustration of a mathematician confronting an unsolvable equation. "I freely admit that science hasn't unlocked all the mysteries of human experience, but our ignorance doesn't justify leaping to supernatural explanations." Augustine's smile carried both compassion and challenge. "Supernatural? My dear Bertrand, you speak as though the soul is some sort of mystical addendum to human nature, like a ghost hiding in a machine. But what if consciousness itself is the most natural thing in the universe? What if matter is simply the visible expression of spiritual reality, rather than spirit being an illusion created by matter? The conversation was attracting more attention now. A young graduate student at a nearby table had abandoned all pretense of working on her dissertation and was taking notes with the intensity of someone witnessing history. An elderly professor emeritus, nursing a beer in the corner, found himself nodding along with arguments that challenged everything he had taught for 40 years. Russell pushed his spectacles up his nose, a gesture that had become automatic during decades of intellectual combat. But Augustine, you're asking me to accept on faith what you cannot demonstrate through reason. If souls exist, where is the evidence? Where are the measurements, the observations, the reproducible experiments that would convince a skeptical mind? Evidence? Augustine's laugh was rich with irony. You sit here demanding scientific proof of consciousness while using your consciousness to make the demand. You insist on measuring the very thing that makes measurement possible. It's like asking someone to use a ruler to measure the ruler itself. The force of the argument hit Russell with almost physical impact. He had built his philosophical career on the bedrock of empirical evidence, but Augustine was challenging the very foundations of empiricism itself. How does consciousness prove consciousness? How does the mind examine the mind without falling into infinite regress? You're suggesting that consciousness is somehow outside the natural order, Russell said carefully, feeling his way through treacherous philosophical terrain. But evolution provides a perfectly adequate explanation for how consciousness could have developed through natural selection. Awareness confers survival advantages, no mysterious soul required. Augustine leaned forward, his intensity now focused like a laser. Evolution may explain how consciousness could have developed, but it cannot explain why anything should be conscious at all. Why shouldn't we simply be unconscious automatons, responding to stimuli without any inner experience? What adaptive advantage does subjective awareness provide that couldn't be achieved by unconscious information processing? The question hit the tavern like a thunderclap. Even the background conversations stopped as patrons found themselves confronting a puzzle that challenged everything they thought they knew about their own existence. Why should there be anything it's like to be human? Why should the lights be on inside any of our heads? Russell felt the familiar vertigo that comes with staring into philosophical abysses. Perhaps consciousness is simply an emergent property of complex information processing. When neural networks reach sufficient complexity, awareness emerges naturally, like wetness emerging from the interaction of hydrogen and oxygen molecules. Emergent properties, Augustine repeated slowly, tasting the words like wine. A beautiful phrase, Bertrand, but does it really explain anything? Or is it simply a sophisticated way of saying, somehow, something happens? You might as well invoke magic and be done with it. The debate was reaching depths that neither man had anticipated, pulling them into questions that had tormented philosophers for millennia. Around them, the tavern had become a temple to human inquiry, where the most fundamental questions about existence were being examined with surgical precision and passionate commitment to truth, regardless of where that truth might lead. The fire in the tavern's small hearth crackled with renewed intensity as Murphy added another log, the flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the intellectual sparks flying between the two philosophers. The night had grown deeper, and with it, the conversation had taken on an almost confessional quality, as if the darkness outside had given both men permission to speak truths they rarely voiced in the bright light of academic discourse. Augustine swirled the remaining whiskey in his glass, watching the liquid catch the firelight like liquid amber holding fragments of eternity. Bertrand, I want to share something with you that I've never spoken about in any of my formal writings. There was a moment, years after my conversion, when I experienced what I can only describe as a complete dissolution of the boundary between my consciousness and something infinitely larger than myself. Russell raised an eyebrow, his skeptical nature warring with genuine curiosity about his companion's inner life. Are you about to regale me with mystical visions and divine voices? Because I should warn you, I've heard every variation of religious experience, and they all sound remarkably similar to neurological events we can observe in laboratory settings. Augustine's laugh held no defensiveness, only the quiet confidence of a man who had wrestled with doubt and emerged with deeper faith. No voices, no visions, my friend. Just a moment of absolute clarity in which I understood that my consciousness was not a product of my brain, but rather, my brain was a temporary instrument through which consciousness was expressing itself. It was like realizing that I had spent my entire life believing I was the violin when I was actually the music. The analogy struck Russell with unexpected force. Despite his materialist convictions, he found himself drawn into the metaphor, examining it from multiple angles like a complex mathematical proof. That's a beautiful image, Augustine, but beauty doesn't constitute evidence. What you describe sounds like a profound psychological experience, but why interpret it as evidence for an immortal soul rather than as a fascinating quirk of neural activity? Augustine set down his glass and leaned forward, his eyes intense, but not challenging. Because, dear Russell, the experience revealed something that no amount of neural mapping could explain: the absolute uniqueness and irreplaceable value of individual consciousness. In that moment, I understood that every human being is not just a temporary arrangement of matter, but a unique verse in an eternal poem that could never be repeated. Even if I granted your interpretation, Russell replied, his voice taking on the careful tone of a man navigating dangerous intellectual waters, how do you reconcile the beauty of that vision with the reality of human suffering? If souls are immortal and precious beyond measure, why does a supposedly benevolent universe permit such extraordinary pain and injustice? The question landed like a physical blow, and Augustine's composure cracked slightly. For a moment, the ancient saint looked every one of his many years, the weight of humanity's suffering written in the lines around his eyes. Ah, Bertrand, you've touched the deepest wound in any believer's heart. I won't insult you with easy answers about divine mystery or the necessity of free will. Russell waited, recognizing that his opponent was wrestling with something far more personal than abstract theology. Around them, the tavern had grown quieter still, as if the very air was holding its breath for Augustine's response. I spent years as a young man believing that a good God would create a world without suffering, Augustine continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. But I've come to understand that consciousness itself requires the possibility of pain. Without vulnerability, there can be no love. Without mortality, there can be no courage. Without injustice, there can be no compassion. The soul's immortality doesn't exempt it from suffering. It transforms suffering into the raw material of spiritual growth. Russell felt an unexpected surge of respect for his opponent's honesty. You're asking me to believe that cosmic torture is somehow justified by spiritual education. That seems like an extraordinarily high price to pay for whatever lessons consciousness might learn. Not justified, Augustine corrected gently. Transformed. There's a profound difference. I don't believe God orchestrates suffering for pedagogical purposes, but I do believe that consciousness possesses an almost miraculous capacity to transmute even the most devastating experiences into wisdom, compassion, and spiritual depth that wouldn't be possible otherwise. The conversation was pulling both men into territory that felt simultaneously ancient and urgently contemporary. Russell found himself thinking of the wars he had witnessed, the friends he had lost, the countless moments when his rationalist philosophy had felt inadequate in the face of raw human anguish. But Augustine, Russell said slowly, if individual consciousness is as precious as you claim, doesn't that make the finality of death even more tragic? Every day, thousands of unique verses in the eternal poem are simply erased. Where is the justice in that? Where is the cosmic preservation of all this irreplaceable value? Augustine's response came with the quiet intensity of a man who had stood beside countless deathbeds and watched the light fade from beloved eyes. You assume that death is erasure, but what if it's transformation? What if the preciousness of individual consciousness is so profound that the universe itself cannot bear to let it simply vanish? What if what we call death is actually birth into a mode of existence that makes our current understanding of consciousness seem like shadows on a cave wall? Russell found himself genuinely moved by the passion in Augustine's voice, even as his rational mind catalogued objections. That's a beautiful hope, my friend, but hope is not evidence. And in the absence of evidence, isn't it more honest to acknowledge our ignorance, rather than constructing elaborate metaphysical systems to comfort ourselves? Perhaps, Augustine conceded with a slight smile. But tell me, Bertrand, in your heart of hearts, when you consider the possibility that consciousness simply ends at death, do you feel that such a universe makes sense? Does it seem likely that a cosmos capable of producing Shakespeare and Mozart and Marie Curie would simply waste such magnificent achievements by letting them dissolve into nothingness? The question hung between them like a challenge to the very foundations of rational thought. Russell felt the familiar tension between his intellectual honesty and his deep appreciation for human achievement and potential. The tavern around them seemed to pulse with the accumulated weight of human creativity and aspiration, and for a moment, Even the most committed materialist found himself wondering whether such magnificence could truly be destined for complete oblivion. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting the tavern in a warm reddish light that seemed to soften the edges of the debate while intensifying its emotional core. The late hour had thinned the crowd to a handful of dedicated listeners who seemed to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just an intellectual exercise, but a profound exploration of what it means to be human in an uncertain universe. Russell removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, a gesture that had become ritual whenever he found himself at the limits of rational argument. Augustine, you've forced me to confront something I've spent decades trying to avoid. The possibility that my commitment to evidence and reason might be motivated as much by fear as by intellectual honesty. Augustine studied his companion's face with the gentle attention of a physician examining a patient. Fear of what, my friend? Fear of hoping for something that might not be true, Russell admitted, his voice carrying a vulnerability that few had ever heard from the famously confident philosopher. I've seen too many lives destroyed by false promises of immortality, too many people who substituted wishful thinking for clear-eyed engagement with reality. I chose skepticism because it seemed like the safer path. If you expect nothing beyond this life, you can't be disappointed. The confession hung in the air between them with surprising weight. Augustine reached across the table and briefly touched Russell's hand, a gesture of human connection that transcended philosophical disagreement. But Bertrand, what if skepticism itself is a form of faith? What if your certainty that consciousness ends at death is just as unprovable as my belief in its immortality? Russell felt the familiar sensation of intellectual ground shifting beneath his feet. I've never claimed certainty about consciousness ending at death. I've simply insisted that we should proportion our beliefs to the available evidence. And yet, Augustine pressed gently, you live as though death is final. You make choices, form relationships, and pursue goals based on the assumption that this life is all there is. Isn't that itself a leap of faith, every bit as dramatic as believing in the soul's immortality? The insight struck Russell with surprising force. Throughout his long career dismantling religious arguments, he had presented himself as the voice of reason opposing faith. But Augustine was suggesting that materialism itself required faith. Faith that consciousness was nothing more than neural activity. Faith that meaning could emerge from meaninglessness. Faith that the universe was ultimately purposeless. Murphy approached their table with fresh drinks, sensing that the conversation was approaching some kind of climax. His weathered face showed the wisdom of a man who had listened to countless debates over the years, and he moved with the reverence of someone who understood that great minds at work were a form of prayer. Perhaps, Russell said slowly, accepting his gin with a nod of thanks, the real question isn't whether souls are immortal, but whether the question itself reveals something important about the nature of consciousness. The fact that we can even conceive of immortality, that we can imagine ourselves persisting beyond bodily death, suggests something profound about the kind of beings we are. Augustine smiled, recognizing that his opponent was approaching the heart of the matter from an unexpected angle. Go on? Well, Russell continued, his voice gaining strength as he followed the thread of his reasoning. No other species, as far as we can determine, contemplates its own mortality with anything approaching our intensity. Animals may fear death instinctively, but they don't write poetry about it, don't build monuments to the dead, don't spend their lives wrestling with questions about what lies beyond. The very fact that we're capable of this conversation suggests that consciousness itself is something remarkable in the cosmos. Augustine felt a surge of unexpected hope. And if consciousness is remarkable enough to generate questions about its own immortality, perhaps those questions are worth taking seriously, regardless of whether we can prove the answers through conventional means. The two men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each processing the implications of where their dialogue had led them. Around them, the tavern seemed to hold its breath, as if the building itself understood that something significant was being resolved, not through victory or defeat, but through mutual recognition of the mystery they were confronting. Russell spoke first, his voice thoughtful and measured. I find myself in a curious position, Augustine. I cannot accept your belief in the soul's immortality based on the evidence available to me, but I also cannot dismiss the possibility as easily as I once did. Perhaps the greatest wisdom lies in acknowledging that consciousness itself is so extraordinary that we should remain humble about our capacity to understand its ultimate nature. Augustine nodded slowly, recognizing both concession and integrity in Russell's words. And I find myself grateful for your skepticism, my friend. It has forced me to examine my own beliefs more carefully, to distinguish between what I know through experience and what I accept through faith. Perhaps the soul's immortality cannot be proven, only experienced, but that doesn't make it less real for those who have glimpsed its truth. The fire in the hearth gave a final flicker before settling into darkness, and Murphy began the gentle process of encouraging his last customers to make their way home. But neither Augustine nor Russell seemed ready to leave. They had spent the evening as intellectual adversaries and emerged as something deeper, two human beings who had looked into the abyss of mortality together and found, if not answers, then at least the courage to continue asking the right questions. "You know what strikes me most about our conversation?" Russell said as he gathered his coat. "We began by debating whether souls are immortal or just wishful thinking, but we've ended up exploring something more fundamental, what it means to be conscious in a universe that may or may not care about consciousness." Augustine stood as well, his movements carrying the satisfaction of a man who had engaged in meaningful combat and emerged enriched rather than defeated. "Perhaps that's the real gift of such questions, Bertrand. Not the answers we find, but the way asking them transforms us into the kinds of beings capable of caring about truth, beauty, love, and justice, regardless of whether those things outlast our individual deaths." As they walked toward the door, both men understood that their debate would continue far beyond this single evening, not because either expected to convert the other, but because the questions they had explored together were too important to abandon. Whether souls were immortal, or consciousness simply ended at death, the very fact that beings like themselves could contemplate such mysteries suggested that the universe had achieved something remarkable in the evolution of human awareness. The Princeton night was crisp and clear, stars visible despite the ambient light of the university town. As they stood outside Murphy's tavern, preparing to part ways, both Augustine and Russell found themselves looking up at the vast expanse above them, each seeing there a reflection of their own deepest convictions about the nature of consciousness and its place in the cosmic order. "Until we meet again, my friend," Augustine said, extending his hand. "Indeed," Russell replied, grasping it warmly, "whether in this life or whatever may follow." And with that acknowledgement of mystery, they walked away in different directions, leaving behind them in the tavern's warm interior the echo of one of humanity's most enduring conversations, the dialogue between faith and reason, hope and skepticism, the longing for immortality and the courage to face mortality that defines what it means to be consciously human in an uncertain universe.